Professor David Bowman is the Director of the Fire Centre of the University of Tasmania. Using the City of Hobart as a model system, David has adopted a multidisciplinary co-design study to investigate bushfire risk management at the wildland-urban interface. His team includes a diverse range of expertise from social, geographic and ecological sciences. Collectively, the team's research has developed a novel conceptual models to assessment of fire hazards and illuminated opportunities and barriers to community bushfire preparedness, leading to the creation of new tools and techniques to assess and map fire hazards across the wildland-urban interface. David, please take it away.
Thanks. Always a fan of coming back to Darwin. And I was just actually looking at my co-authors, and Grant Williams, Linda Pryor, Owen Price, who are part of my team, all spent time in Darwin. They're now in my lab, which is really cool to have that continuity. I've published, I actually noticed I published with some of these people over 100 papers each. Some of those people, Grant and Linda, have worked for over 20 years together. So it's a really enduring relationship, and we've got a whole bunch of young, enthusiastic new people. So is it this one? On this side?
Oh, no, other side.
This side. Where do I point it?
Towards the back room. Is that not working?
This side.
Yeah.
Can I?
Right now, go again.
Oh. Is there a lag? Okay. I'm trying again. It did work.
There you go.
Okay, so it's always good to have an outline of the talk. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I have developed a new discipline actually called pyrogeography. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I didn't make up the word, but I certainly appropriated it. I have been incredibly lucky to be able to get a constellation of quite large grants, including an ARC Laureate Fellowship, to fund this project. I'm about 40% through a 5-year program, so I'm just going to report on where we're at. I think we're making some pretty good progress. I want to also have a little bit of a philosophical moment, I suppose, thinking about translational co-design research. And then I'm going to end with, ultimately where I've got to, that if you want to adapt to changing wildfire regimes. I need to stress right at the outset, this is a gravely serious topic. And my life, I never would have thought that I would be, as a response variable now, billions of dollars and number of human lives lost. That's actually where this is going, and the sorts of people I'm partnering with, including the largest reinsurer in the world. So these are serious, serious matters. So why does it go backward? Okay, so pyrogeography. For a long time, I've been doing what I've been doing intuitively. And I remember a reviewer, I love reviewers, particularly bad ones, going, of a grant, oh, Bowman's a dilettante. It's just all over the place. And I go, okay, mate, that's actually a good criticism. But what you're really criticising is that I don't have a field or a domain or a discipline or a doctrine. So I will create one. And my one is pyrogeography, and I'm very pleased to announce that I've just founded a new journal called the Journal of Pyrogeography. I'm the founding editor. It's an Elsevier journal. It's really got a who's who of pyrogeographers, and there are many people now. I go to workshops, and it's kind of cool. The young people go, I'm a pyrogeographer. Like, that's just so cool. Because they are identifying with something which is holistic, multi-scale, transdisciplinary. And what's particularly nice about pyrogeography is it's unbounded. So it can be a geographical space from the very local to the house basis, as I'll talk about, like literally to the garden, literally to gardens, or to the entire globe. And we can think about evolutionary questions or we can think about the future, or we can think about the present. And it really does unite these numerous fields. I've published 2 papers now with a an emerging legal bushfire theorist, Philippa McCormack. So we're actually right into the public administration legal. So it's got this human dimensions, of course, you know, my interest in working with Aboriginal people, both here in the Northern Territory and in Tasmania, but also now with contemporary communities. So human dimension, social science is hugely important. So to create a pyrogeographic vehicle, I suppose, I have created a thing called the Fire Centre at the University of Tasmania. What's really nice about the Fire Centre is that it's got these elements. It's really nice that we've won 2 awards the last 2 years for our public outreach and also our research excellence, the applied domain. But we've got these 4 sort of dimensions, and we have, at the bottom right corner there, we have actually built physically a laboratory to power our research. That is called, it's actually 3 laboratories, BioLab 3 for bioenergy, which is going to be for the offtake, bushfire flammability, which I'll talk about, and exposure emissions. Believe it or not, we are actually undertaking a rescue mission for the US EPA lab that Trump has closed in North Carolina. Some of their staff are coming to help us benchmark our laboratory because they did that for us last year to make certain that our exposure system, which is for human exposures, firefighters, they were incredibly generous. Who would have thought in 12 months we would be helping them out? But that is actually a fact. So that's a multi-million-dollar building that I've created. We've got this community outreach, which, you know, it's including apps and so on. Then what's particularly cool, and I would recommend that you do that here, is we've actually created a living fire experiment on the university campus bush reserve. So we're actually doing an experiment, which is PhD student working the experiment walks to his experiment from his office. And that is in close relationship with the City of Hobart. So the program that I'm doing, the Pyrogeographic program, has 7 work packages. I'm not going to talk about the Aboriginal work package, which is ongoing. We're doing a lot of work on the Bass Strait Islands, particularly paleoecological, but that's not going to be part of this talk. And centred, the 7th work package is the tools, techniques and training. So we're trying to really think about how to take a lot of the lessons from our research and drive it into application. It's very nice that we've got such good relationships with state agencies, local council, building relationships with the local insurer, and also, as I said, a global reinsurer. So I'm going to just quickly race through the various work packages of the results to date, so you have a flavour that I'm not just, to excuse the pun, blowing smoke. We've actually got some real progress here. So I'll first of all start with the global analysis of wildfires. What we have published a paper, it's been cited about 130 times in the space of, I don't know, 18 months. We were able to show beyond doubt that there is this surging increase in the intensity of wildfires globally. And it stands to reason. It's interesting, there was a group trying to say that we were wrong, and they had this weird rebuttal you can read, which we basically, I think, you know, have shown that their argument is complete folly because they have a stupid metric. Why this is so powerful, that our metric of these intense fire events, is that it actually follows predictably to the effect of climate change, particularly fuel aridity, which is actually a really big deal up here, by the way. So that this intensity we're seeing, very, very dry fuels, aridifying climate under climate change, driving extreme fires. So what we then did is currently in review with science. We looked at major fire disasters using the Munich Re database. brokered a deal with Munich Re. This data is now so valuable, they won't share it anymore because the proprietorial interest of the exploding interest in fire disasters. And luckily I got in on the ground floor and organised data sharing agreement, very, very important. And we had to reconstruct the last few years since the embargo on any further sharing of data, because as you know, there's all of these fires all around the world. But basically, again, tracking that increase in intensity, we're seeing an outbreak of enormously serious fires, and again, well correlated with worsening fire weather conditions and of course these increasing intensity of fires. So we've just got a paper which actually it's not in review, it'll be published. We then looked at future under 1.5 degrees, which is basically now, looking at the urban interface. And basically the message of this work is that the areas, I should change that because it's about to be published. The areas that are already experiencing fire disasters, the Mediterranean, European Mediterranean basin, Western US and Southern Australia, particularly Southeastern Australia, are set to see much more worsening of these fire events. That explains why the insurers are very interested in the work we're doing. So we'll now move to this comparative study where we're beginning to look at the drivers, the mechanisms of causing house loss. And it's a really interesting comment here that Owen Price, who originally did a PhD on frugivores here, Owen and I work together closely, and it's basically his response variable is house loss. That's what he does now. Mm-hmm. And I tell you, he's got a fan club in the agencies because it's all about what makes houses get destroyed. And we're excited that we're now, again, well before the LA fire, we'd entered into a collaboration with a Californian fire scientist, Alexander Seifert, where we're looking at a comparative study of house loss between the US and Australia. And again, the fact that we had a foot in the door in that field, you know, the amount of interest and also the ability to say something authoritative about that event. So Owen and I and Stefania Ronde, one of the other postdocs in the group, have weirdly, we wrote this paper which was sort of theorising about how you would burn an urban environment down, and started thinking of all of the mechanistic relationships between the ember storms, the radiation coming out of the fires, and then the gardens, and trying to actually think through how you would actually even think about this problem. And it's one of these nice things in science when you're actually theorising about something and it actually happens. At scale, you know, everybody's heard in LA. Well, we're writing this paper thinking about what would it take to destroy houses. And the amazing thing is doing the literature search. One of the core pieces of literature was from the intentional destruction of cities with firestorms, which had been, investigated because, of course, the Second World War, we burnt down several cities in Japan and in Europe, Germany, and of course, nuclear weapons. So it's kind of a strange thing to be drawing literature about how to burn cities down, and then, you know, cities start burning down. So then what we have been doing is we've been doing this really interesting thing where you may have heard of BOW, bushfire attack levels. If you haven't, you should, because it's coming your way here. So what bushfire attack levels really are, there's a building crisis, and bushfire attack levels which are used by councils and state government to basically enforce building design, and it's all about radiation load, and radiation load's got an exponent. So basically how far you are from bushland and the amount of radiation load a structure would receive. What we're doing using, very lucky, we've got a postdoc whose actual PhD was using a supercomputer, Amila Wickramasinghe, using fluid dynamic models in supercomputer, where we're actually building a GIS application where we can think about not only radiation load, but also ember load, which is the other reason most houses burn down from bushfires, not because of radiation, but because the embers get into the house cavities. And so being able to look at, and that's sort of been a holy grail to create a GIS application where you could estimate, and we've been using that in using City of Hobart as a case study. So we'll look at flammability and fuel management. What we did in this case is, again, another really good example of why you need to do comprehensive literature review. We actually looked at the advice that is provided all around, at least in the European-speaking world. Stefania is actually Italian, so she's multilingual. She searched all of the literature, and we realised that what had happened was that fire managers, either through a process of Chinese whispers or because practitioners are smart and they solve practical problems, but they'd come up with this idea of zonation in gardens and defendable space. And we were able to link that zonation to physical processes which are related to radiation, ember, and direct flame contact. Not to say that's original, but it was at least able to put it in one place in the scientific literature. Believe it or not, this had never been written about in the scientific literature, certainly in the practitioner literature. But I always say, and I'll come to that, about this tension between practitioners and scientists, that it's kind of important to find the generality, because if you have the generality, and you can find, you can innovate. So then what we did, based on that, we went into actual people's gardens and we did garden assessments using the thing, using our learning, particularly from City of Hobart. Again, it was all in the head of the assessor. They would go in and make an assessment, say that's a dangerous garden. You go, what's a dangerous garden? And say, oh, it is. So we pulled it all apart using our literature review. We built an expert system that was able to generate scores. And then the really cool thing, which I'll come to, is we were able to operationalize that expert system in an app. So that would just jump. Weirdly, most of this stuff is really in the social science domain, that you can take things scientifically, but then you run into humans, and humans are really difficult. They've got feelings, they've got attitudes, they've got politics. So, you know, breaking news, we did some, you know, research, breaking news that men and women are different, but actually not all men and women are different. It's really confusing. But it's actually, why would that be of interest? It's of interest because if you are messaging, if you're messaging and you think your audience is just a standard human, then you've got news, because it really depends on people's gender and then, of course, maybe their culture, their linguistic background. So suddenly it starts making communication and trying to educate people about their evacuation intention. So we were really lucky to be able to look at a social, public health, do a 5-yearly survey health report. And after the 2016 fires, the Tasmanian Fire Service put in questions about evacuation intentions. We were able to re-ask that question, and we were able to show that there's this shift right across the board, regardless of men and women, rural and urban. We're seeing an increasing tendency for people to want to leave. Now, it's really interesting. The heroic people are the ones who are not going to leave, are the rural men. But we're seeing this change, and whether that's a change because the messaging is better, or is it a change because people are just figuring out that it's just going to be really crazy when a fire happens. I don't know, but it was really fun to get into thinking about what we were calling the archetypes, and others have thought about this, because that then starts affecting the way you would be thinking about your messaging. And then another opportunistic study, which is really, there was a social science panel study. And so what I did was I decided that we could post hoc ordinate questions about appetites for fuel treatments down at the most self-deterministic, naturalistic is burning by bushland by Aboriginal people in Tasmania. And right at the top is basically just levelling the joint, turning it into a car park. And what was interesting is that when we did the analysis of the social science, the only thing that came out was political orientation. The Greens are down here. Now, the problem is this down here, what the Greens want doesn't exist much. There's one or two examples of cultural burning programs in Tasmania, but it's what they want. So it's like people have cottoned onto something that is aspirational, haven't even thought through how you would make this happen. But what's really interesting are the Liberals, who are more of the command and control and artificial, is that you can see it's much broader spectrum. We discovered the teals that sort of go down into the more green orientation. And interesting, the non-aligned or the Labor group, and of course there's lots of caveats about this. I say this paper is an example of what should be done at scale, is that the middle of the road, agency, empowerment, but, getting the community sort of support for bushland, doing government burning, that's really, the Labor, the sort of, white bread alternative, I suppose. So I think really it starts opening up that what we've got to be mindful of is that fuel management is political and, more importantly, can become politicised. So all fire managers need to be very careful that they don't unnecessarily politicise this topic, because then there will be rivers of pain. So we've got to bring the community on the journey, and that I'll come to some of the ideas that I've got about that. So then what we did was we sent a social scientist, this paper will be forthcoming soon, into gardens and talking about people, how they feel about gardens. Breaking news, people have really strong emotions about their gardens. And what we also found is that there's this sort of disconnection between how people feel about the risk of their garden relative to the risk of the bushland, or even more interestingly, the risk of their neighbour's garden. Most people think their garden is perfect, and it's the fire problem is somebody else's problem, which is really, starts doing your head in. But we've also uncovered that there's this aching need for good advice, and that's hopefully where some of the things that these tools and techniques, that work package 7 I was talking about. So it feeds into here. So what I want to do is just very, very quickly reflect on, what I've learned in doing this work. So, it's like the Martians and the Venetians, men and women. There's this very fake binary between researchers and practitioners. That's what it's, it's like, oh, they're different. And the classic, model, which I think is one of the reasons for that disjunction, I suppose, and maybe, I don't know whether disrespect or disconnection, is that, the classic model is the researcher does the research, they innovate, and then translation follows. So the researcher goes, oh, I've got a new can opener. And then the practitioner goes, yeah, but we use jars, and it's like, well, oh, thanks for sharing, So what I've realised is that the lag and lead in applied science is that what we've done is we've flipped this around. And we've actually made the practitioners lead, as I will explain. And that can mean that the translation can actually preempt or precede the scientific publication. One of the other things that we've been doing is we've been framing current policy and practice as a scientific question. What do I mean by that? One of the really nice things we're doing with our experiment on the University Reserve is that we are actually scientifically investigating what the council already does. So why would you do that? That's stupid. They're already doing it. They say, yeah, but they don't know why it works. They just know it works. And if you're a scientist, you can have a generality that then you can actually innovate it. And also you've achieved one of the most important steps in co-design, you have buy-in. Because if you go back to the practitioner and say, that practice you do, well, we realise why it works. They're immediately interested in that because they're invested in their practice. Oh, by the way, we can improve it. Really? Yeah, watch this. So another thing that I've realised is that the process of these co-design can actually be the project. You could be so limited in trust. I heard a fantastic thing at the conference I went to last week, is that something like transformation travels at the speed of trust, and that, you know, really you've got to have these trust relationships, and so just working through a project can actually be a really important step. So some of the examples of these different approaches, that, you know, the classic deployment model, we've invented an app, and we're going to, hopefully, we're in negotiations with Resilience Building Council to deploy our app as part of their self-assessment app. So that's the classical model. We invented something and then we're going to try to get it deployed. It's actually surprisingly difficult to get through what's known in the game as the innovation valley of death. It's actually quite difficult. Faye Johnston, Grant Williams are directors of a company, the Aerator app that I was originally involved in building. It's now a multi-million or several $1 million company. And the amount, you know, this is like 5 years of business negotiations. The chair of the board's the former premier of Tasmania. This is like serious stuff. You've got to be really want to do. Academics should really be advised, be very, very careful to try to take something to market, because it's extremely difficult. You've got to learn a whole new lexicon, a whole new way of doing business, and you need literally business advisors. So an example of application for publication, in our fire lab, we've assessed hundreds of species of native and non-native plants. And one of the things we did with the City of Hobart is we put out a brochure, evidence-based brochure. We've never published any of this work, which got really interesting implications for evolution, all sorts of questions about why, you know, native, non-native plants are flammable, how they're flammable, what plant flammability is, all that cool stuff. None of it has been published. We just prioritised getting it out. The mayor loved this so much, we had a launch at our fire lab. The brochure was something the council could say, look what we're doing. So it's a really good example of, you know, that lag and lead question where we inverted it. And then that policy and practices scientific questions, and work we've been doing with Owen, I've been doing with Owen Price, is that there's this 100-metre rule of, and this is in New South Wales with the housing crisis. The New South Wales planning is that if you're within 100 metres of bushland, then that's when, you know, the BAL kicks in, where you've got this extra transactional cost of building a house. And so can't you make that like a little bit smaller? Because the implications of a little bit smaller for a housing development, a suburb development, building developments, individual homeowner, we're talking tens of thousands, in some cases millions of dollars. So Owen has been able to get house loss data in New South Wales. Very difficult to get house loss data, I might add. And it turns out the 100-metre rule, which was made on the basis of no science, because this is the first science, is actually really, really good until it isn't. And it isn't when there's catastrophic fire weather. That's when the embers are going into the suburbs and wiping out houses, you know, up to 1 kilometre away. And that has huge implications of how do you think through, you know, what you're doing. And that's maybe where retrofit garden design and so on is going to be really interesting. So just to wind up, it's really important if you're doing transformative things to have a vision thing. All right, I didn't start with a vision thing, I ended with the vision thing. I wanted to prove to you that I'm walking the walk. I'm actually doing this stuff. I really am doing this stuff. But I have a vision thing, and I was invited by Science a couple of years ago to really talk about strategies and the vision of what fire-safe communities could look like globally, but using Australia as a particular example. Mechanical thinning, which will be the offtake for the bioenergy, green fire breaks, which will be fantastic for biodiversity, amenity values. So you have parklands, these beautiful parklands, have herbivory, maybe native and non-native plant, non-native herbivores, and prescribed burning, which will be part of it, and cultural burning. And you have Jason Sharpless, firefighter, and also a man of Indigenous descent. It's really nice to be able to share a vision of what a fire-safe Australia could look like, and to put that there and say, you know, we actually are trying to achieve something that is practical and sustainable. And this really has caught the attention of the insurers, because the reinsurers are sending messages, quite clear messages, that soon bushfire insurance is not going to be a thing in Southern Australia. Now, I just need you to think about what that means. Bushfire insurance isn't going to be a thing. And if insurance isn't a thing, that means you can't buy and sell houses with loans, because there's no guarantee for your asset. You can actually crash the entire system without insurance. So this is a non-trivial issue, and we may be looking at the trade-off of either government is going to become the insurer of last resort, or the government is going to step in and have a massive investment in reducing fuel. I've been in talks with some other states I can't talk about at the moment, of taking some of these ideas to scale. So this is not a fantasy. This is actually quite real. So the very last thing, and again, really nice to go to conferences. Conferences can be boring. I'm at the Natural Hazards Conference and I'm hearing the same talk over and over again. I'm getting really bored. And then I go, you know what? I just think I've crystallized the whole thing. So I did. And I published a paper last year in Nature Sustainability, where I actually proposed what's called the wildfire adaptation triad, the translational challenge. And basically what it argues is that wildfire adaptation, three-legged stool, is you've got to do three things. Now, the breaking news is we are doing all of those three things. The catch is we're not doing them in a coordinated way. Every agency is doing research and development, education and demonstration, and has mechanisms to incentivise or penalise behaviours, but they are not in an integrated way. To do it in an integrated way, we need research and development that leads to education and demonstration. So the demonstration side, one of the things we're doing with education and demonstration in the domain in Tasmania, which is a big bushland reserve right in the core of the city, I've negotiated with the City of Hobart. We're going to have an interpretive trail, and it's going to go through and explain Aboriginal history. The domain is very important for Aboriginal culture for a variety of reasons. And then we're going to talk about what the invasion of the casuarinas and what the council is doing about that based on our scientific research. And then the second last station looks over Hobart, looks up to Canini, Mount Wellington, and says, did you know, because most people weren't alive then, did you know in 1967, this city was nearly burnt down? So we leave that to end. And the very last station is, what are we going to do about it? And that is the education demonstration step. And what we're going to do with incentives and enforcements is that we've got to do administrative innovation, legal reform. That's why Philip and McCormack's work is so important, that we need, working with insurers, working with councils, working with government, to actually have behavioural economics, have to have price signals, rewards and penalties. Because the price signal is that there's going to be no insurance soon. And also you go broke trying to fight the fires, which, you know, at the moment, the Commonwealth picks up the tab. You have a fire season, helicopters go out, you spend tens of millions of dollars. The ballooning budgets are happening all over, bringing in, you know, aviation assets, huge growth in expenditure, but the problem is getting worse and worse because of climate change. So that is my proposition, and it's worth having a look at that paper. I've got a conceptual model about how we can go from the dysfunctional state to just a co-option of adaptive management. In fact, co-option, one of the diagrams, Brett Murphy, and I published, which is this, you know, cup and ball diagram, but looking at it from a socio-ecological perspective. I think I'll leave that there. Thank you. Do you have any
questions in the room or online?
Can you design an ember-proof house? Are you working with architects on houses that are with their embers?
Yeah, so ember modelling, ember storms. There's a bunch of people, and Amal Wickramasinghe, I'm putting him in touch with. There's about 4 groups in Australia working using fluid dynamic models, embers. Some of them, it's basically like sand or snow. It's kind of weird, but some of them you can get like embers can mound up, and so you get ember drifts, which can mound up on the edge of buildings. But the thing that we're worrying about is the penetration into cavities. And if you think about a roof cavity, how dry it is up there, you only need one ember to go into a roof cavity and land on all that dust, and it just burns the building down. So there is actually guidance for. One of the regrets of renovating my house is I didn't put a screen under. It would be very expensive, but I didn't realise that I needed to do it. You can block up the holes, but the better way of doing it is you actually have ember screens under the sheeting, but certainly ember guards over the air vents and so on are really standard practice. And the other really cool thing, there's this amazing guy, there's so many interesting people in this field, called Alan Green at Wollongong. He's an engineer, and what he's been doing is trying to think of using irrigation sprays to counteract embers. So to put up a shield of water so the embers are going into the shield. Now, it's all about timing and water supply, spray type. And I point out that the sprays which are in this building, that was an innovation which happened about 150 years ago. There's compliance, there's this whole elaborate methodology. I use these interiors as an example in this paper, whereas the exterior irrigation wildfire sprays, it's an absolute research frontier. It's a wild west. You can get plumbers to do it. There's arguments about what the best spray heads are. And if you're in a remote property, you've got to think the numbers are, you might need 200,000 litres of water and that might give you 15 or 20 minutes of protection. So you can start seeing all of these questions. Some people have remote spray irrigation. I seem to remember the previous Vice Chancellor activated his spray remotely. But it's a whole huge, fantastic, wonderful adaptation field for engineering. Yeah.
That was fascinating, thank you. I work on water, so I don't want to detract from fire, but I was wondering whether the people who work on floods because everything you said would appear to be, you could just substitute the word for flood there and flood hazard, and everything would translate. Have you had any people? Well,
weirdly, I had very enjoyable interactions with a fellow you may know called Jason Alexander at ANU, and he wanted to, and he's talking about having a symposium, that exact collision of flood mitigation and bushfire. And Jason's a fascinating customer because he came from, had a farm and he's a practitioner, but he's also, a theorist. And his thing, you've got a whole program on water, leaky weirs, and all of those cool things about retrofitting catchments. One of the really big differences between fire and water is that the water people had grasped the idea of catchment management, where the idea of firescape management, firescapes in management paradigm hasn't been embraced. And another difference is that that therefore leads to catchment management authorities. But what has happened in fire is, because of bureaucracies, the Napoleonic tendency to consolidate and get bigger and bigger, more and more regime, is that fire agencies are now being absorbed into emergency services, super departments, police, certainly what's happening in Tasmania, they're getting bigger and bigger, which means that they become more and more disconnected from the community, which makes it harder to do catchment management works. That's why I'm a fan. Local councils are really weird, but local government is also really, I think, if they can have the right people, you can have this incredible opportunity for being pathfinders in the adaptation pathway, you know, for fire. So yeah, I haven't explored that, but if
You
you're
don't need any more work.
then send Jason an email and say you're really excited about that, because he just sent me an email yesterday saying, let's do this. And I'm going, oh, okay.
In 2016, I went around Australia, interviewed a whole bunch of people about fire management, because I was curious about how it was different practices in different parts of the country. And one comment stuck and sort of echoed as I went around Australia, and that was, if you're a politician, breaking a bottle of champagne on a new U-boot helicopter to put out fires will get you a lot of political points, but lighting the first match on a preventive burn could be considered political suicide if it doesn't go right. So I think that accentuates the two silos that seem to be in existence, the preventive and the mitigation. Is that gap, through your research, is that gap getting closer, or is it still quite divided?
So we've just started a project with our social science team on shared responsibility. And so shared responsibility is this really amazing concept. And the idea of shared responsibility, but then, you know, as the aphorism says, responsibility shared is responsibility not taken. So there's this sort of like, is it a get out of jail card for the agencies? How do you devolve power to communities? So one of the things, and how do you give time for people, particularly in Southern Australia, who've got commutes and, you know, cost of living pressures, and a lot of people who are living on the urban fringe, which are fire prone, are doing it not for the amenity value, they're doing it for affordability. So we've got all of these sort of constellation of pressures, which make this really serious. One of the things we're thinking about with I see shared responsibility as an amazing way to get in at the question of why is the investment in preparation mitigation works so disproportionately small. There's a number the Productivity Commission had, which I've heard reported, I've never sourced it, which was 3% of, you know, fire management compared to the shiny, exciting things. So you've got this, so there's a couple of ideas that we could have an enforced sort of ratio that for a bad fire season, say if you spend $1 million, $10 million on firefighting, you've therefore the following, you know, next couple of years, you've got to spend 10%, 20% of that on mitigation works to try to get some investment into mitigation. You have to mandate that, you have to force politicians to do that. But how do you have that leverage? Because the agencies are getting bigger and bigger. Obviously, it's exciting to have aircraft, helicopters, you know, huge contracts. There's a whole industrial complex being built around this stuff, you know, the drops. This very, very big money, and we're barely getting, Owen Price has been doing work on actually the effectiveness of drops, but not the cost effectiveness. That's not on the table yet. Even talk about the dollars that are being spent. So the answer, what we're doing is we're realising that in amongst the shared responsibility idea, there's what we're calling bridging groups. There's actually, once you scratch the surface, there are an amazing number of bridging groups. There's gender identity bridging groups. There's mental health bridging groups. There's disability bridging groups. There's there's the unions. There's this amazing roster of people who are trying to bridge between the community, or communities to be more accurate, and the agencies. And I think a bridging group is more likely to have political leverage to make the argument that there's got to be more investment into the community, because individuals are just really lone voices. But I'm, you know, because of what I do, the number of emails I get, I don't know what everyday people think professors do, but it's like, oh yeah, I've had this burn on my property, can you come and study it? It's like, no. But you have bridging groups who can advocate for research, development, education, demonstration, incentives and penalties. That's probably where we're going to be able to change that relationship, because in a sense, it's like an enclosed world.
Yeah.
Why would the agencies be advocating for something against what the agency's imperative is to do, which is to become bigger and have more kit? Like, I'm being cynical, but what would be their motivation to do that? You also see in the agencies, and by the way, I have enormous respect for the people who are trying to deal with these matters. It's just, I'm in awe of what they're doing, but from them, it's sort of self-evident they need more resources, so they're investing in the bigger stuff, because they would say, well, look at it from our point of view. We're saving houses here the best way we can. So their imperative is to try to get fire suppression capacity. But we know in the United States, the fire suppression capacity, fire seasons in the US number I looked at yesterday was $2 billion a year now, US dollars. So it's big money, and that's probably just federal. So we have a problem, and you're absolutely right. And it requires, basically, you're in the world of politics.
There was if you don't mind me following up with a question or a comment on that. I interviewed a chap, Greg Pendlebury, I think it was, in South Australia Fire Services, who in the space of 4 years completely flipped what was CFA in South Australia had a very negative rap, disengaged with the community. He flipped that by creating, under a lot of scrutiny, a community engagement team, engaged 6 people. Their role was, previously people would go down, or officers would go down to farmers clubs. It would be the face-to-face thing. He created this social media engagement team, and in 2 years completely flipped that. So increased, not only got information out there and apps, this is how we're sort of monitoring fire events and weather, but also what's your opinion? So creating that feedback loop.
Yeah, but also, to be realistic here, you have to have independent community groups. You have to, because otherwise the risk is you can bake into the community that the government's going to do it for you. And shared responsibility, the paradox of the shared responsibility ethos is you're actually the community. The government cannot do this for you. So that's a really philosophically, Blythe McLennan and John Hamner have written some really nice papers on shared responsibility, and you need to read those. Particularly, they point out this bridging role, it's a beautiful paper. I actually looked at it yesterday, where they actually have a conceptual diagram between the command and control and the community empowered and the bridging. I think it's in the Australasian Journal of Disaster Management. Yes.
Hi Dave, Natalie Rossiter. Thank you, that was a great talk. Just lots of the examples that you gave today were from Hobart, so at one end of the country. What do you think the lessons are for us in the end?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, great question.
Is that what I'm Nixon?
So I think that the lessons are, I've had a connection now to the Northern Territory for over 40 years. When I first came here in 1984, the idea that house loss would occur, the idea that you would use water bombing, helicopter water bombing, that just wasn't real. This side, you could pretty well run through fires, most fires, until the late dry season. Now, because of the invasive weeds and poor fire management, which is fueling an explosion of invasive weeds and urban sprawl. But then on the counter side, aren't we lucky that there are people down the track who've got blocks who irrigate and suppress fire, because you've got probably they're the refuge where the mammals are. I was thinking about that, this place is also an incredibly important wildlife. Greater Darwin area is incredibly important wildlife refuge because, respectfully, the savannas are being so badly managed with fire. They are just being burnt way too much. That's you know, absolutely obvious. And so how do we, I think, you know, Owen, it's great having Owen, because every now and then I can toggle into talking about the Northern Territory. And he said, why are they so fatalistic? And hopefully if Owen's listening or proceed, because he said, you know, in the end, it's just a human problem. You could educate people not to use fire so much. And that's something in the Northern Territory. There's this sense that fire is just this given, and you're going, I don't think so. You go to islands which nobody's on, you know, Indian Island probably been burnt, but you know, if you go, there are islands which you see what happens when you have very low frequency fire. The old trope about lightning, and we are studying lightning is very interesting, is that one of the things in Tasmania we found about lightning is that receptivity of landscape condition and lightning ignitions really is very open environments are much more prone to the lightning strike than closed environments. So yes, there's a lot of lightning up here, but you do wonder what it would have looked like under pre-human conditions for the same lightning, because lightning would have been coming down, would have been falling. And now I'm digressing. I want a paper I do want to write about is that I actually believe most of the savannas, certainly on the mesic part of the Northern Territory, are derived. I think they're actually dry forests. And so then you have these questions if they're derived, they have long history. We know that from the core, which has just been taken out of in Girraween Lagoon, I believe. One of the lagoons just nearby goes back 40,000 years or so. So we do actually know there's been a long history of maintenance of open conditions. But now with this diabolical increase in fire activity, and Aboriginal people were more prudent with the use of fire, weed explosions. But then, you know, we have to think too, I might stand corrected that maybe some of those people who are living in these honorary jungles might lose their houses under extreme fire conditions, because one of the things we do know, paper we published in the Rangeland Journal last year, is that the intensity of the fires is increasing, and that correlates with fuel aridity. So we have a fuel aridity problem. So then you can start thinking about research, development, education, demonstration, incentives. One of the things that, again, Owen pointed out to me is about water and the economics of water is that, yeah, it's expensive to use water to irrigate a garden, but it's a lot less water being used than trying to put a fire out with water. You're using a lot of water to put a fire out if you're doing bucket drops. So you have these interesting, so I think a lot of this is, you know, really encourage local people here to start thinking about, you know, green fire breaks, mowing, native and non-native herbivores, including elephants. So there's all sorts of opportunities for innovation, but you've got to bring the community along. And one of the things I would really like to see this university is it should have a demonstration site. Even if it was, you know, with the Laureate, Lee Point, or just locally, start getting people on their walks to actually learn about fire ecology and learn about what's going on and why it looks like this and why it looks like that. Total gap in communications. And we should be celebrating the last remaining long unburnt patches of savanna. The one behind CSIRO was of huge importance. Probably some people now go and burn it. But, you know, they're the examples that we should really be in little patches on your campus, if there's still some left, really celebrating those things and getting people to think through. So basically a license to think unbounded, a license to think adaptive, do the research and development, but educate and demonstrate based on the latest science, the latest learnings, bring the community with you and try to have incentives and penalties. And tidy towns is an incentive. That's just people are proud of their place. So one incentive can just be pride. Civic pride is an incentive, but to celebrate civic pride, make fire safe community something you could be proud of.
It's probably time for one more question before we have to wrap it up. Is there any more?
I just wanted to kind of speak to that a bit further. You were saying at the start about how in your nature eco-evolution paper that there's a strong link between climate change and the increasing intensity of wildfires. And I guess it's far more apparent down south. Could you speak to any signature of that up here? Because I imagine it's quite confounded with the fact that we've had very significant changes in fire management over the last 40 years. And the spread of Gamba. So it would be curious to understand how climate significant, that is impacting our fires up here. But I don't understand how you would be able to say what it is.
So if I had several of me, one of the things I would do is I would go and get some thermochron eye buttons, humidity temperature sensors, and I would be putting them into the savannah, and I would across some environmental gradients, and I would be looking at, because humidity and temperature can be used the fuel moisture index, and just to start looking at the fuel moisture changes, particularly in different communities, and then you could look, the next level, if you had a fire lab, or you could come to our fire lab, you could start looking at, believe it or not, we know very little about fuel moisture thresholds, combustibility of leaf litter and grass. So those questions, in other words, all of this mantra about early dry season burning, right? It's like, oh, early dry season burning, it's all patchy, it's all this, it's all that. Great story. So what happens in a non-stationary climate? Because you all believe in a non-stationary climate, because the carbon savanna burning scheme is based on the principle of climate change. So you believe in it. So if you believe in it, why aren't you measuring it? Because it's a non-stationary climate. That work was done. Mick Myers and Gary Cook, that was done in an earlier climate that doesn't exist anymore now. So the whole paradigm of early dry season, what is early dry season? Rather than having a philosophical debate about it, go and start measuring it. Because if you measure it, you may find that the fuel aridity is maxing out by June. And that might explain why we observed in our analysis of fire intensity and our proxy of our remote sensing proxy of fuel moisture, we observed an enormous shift in the last 30 or 40 years between, so basically what was October 30 years ago is now like August, something. It's just driving back, and that's got huge implications for the savanna burning. I spoke to Philippa McCormack about this, because baked into it is black letter law, but she, as a lawyer, goes, not really. It would just require an amendment. You could change the savanna burning scheme rule like that. You could just say, oh, because of climate change, which we believe in, because this scheme is about climate change, we've just now made the cut threshold, not the 1st of August, but it could be the 1st of July. But you would need some data for that, right? So, rather than throwing spears at David Bowman and saying that he's all, part of the fact no one's refuted our paper, and I would invite you to canoe so I can miss the spears. The point is, what I would do as a scientist is that don't cost that much. Go and put some eye buttons out there. I mean, if I had more time, I would go and do it for you, but it's not that hard. We actually calibrated it, did a little, I can send you the paper, we did a little calibration study because I got very concerned about the use of this index, and we showed that it's a good index. Obviously, measuring fuel moisture and calibrating it is a sensible thing. Absolute simple little project. Why aren't you doing it? Like, why not? You're too busy.
But don't we have the humidity data from weather stations anyway? We've got all that information from weather stations.
Yeah, but I think getting the granular, trying to get right down into the fine grain of this fuel and this fuel moisture and this combustibility. I mean, the perfect experiment is to measure the fuel moisture and to drop a match in it and find out whether the fire will take. And to do that like every week, going into a dry season, measuring the fuel moisture, and then you go, yeah, now it's spreading, and then you could have that threshold, and then you could interrogate your meteorological data. That
Maybe
would be,
it's not being done because it's not impacting people in the way it is down south.
what's that?
I said maybe it's not being prioritised because it's not impacting people like it is down south. It's just, destroying our wildlife, but who cares about wildlife? It's not
Yeah, but it's kind of an incredibly interesting and important thing because it goes back to
But
what you
like
say.
in terms of like funding.
Natalie's going to say she's already got the data.
But I think we also have a perception up here that climate change isn't happening to the same extent in the tropics.
Yeah.
As
We're not
in the
seeing-
south, we're not getting into drought.
Well, I'll actually tell you something which is
I think that's
sobering.
a perception.
I will tell you something that is sobering, and hopefully I don't get into trouble with Linda and her co-authors. But Linda is involved in a meta-analysis of tree mortality, continental tree mortality paper, which will be forthcoming. So it's absolutely brilliant analysis. And a group from Western Sydney University. And they took Linda, I was the primary person. We did a thing of all of the forestry, the longitudinal data. So they pulled all of the data sets, including Savannah data sets, maybe some of yours. And Linda said to me, oh yeah, brilliant analysis. Do you know where the maximum mortality is occurring? Tree mortality in Australia. And I go, oh, I don't know. The Savannahs. Why? Because the Savannahs, and Linda tells me this story that when she was in Derek Amos, she was in the lab and she noticed that Eucalyptus tetradonta's leaf function just hit a wall at 35 degrees. And it's hidden in one of her papers and it's never been, in other words, a lot of these systems are dialed up right up to the edge of where climate change could be. So I've said to somebody recently, I said, you know, one of the things that might be really sensible to do if you live here is get your antenna up for dieback, because it's not a thing here. It's a thing in Queensland, thing in Tasmania. It's not a thing. But it might be in the next 5 years, people are going to be driving on Stewart Highway going, wow, look at all the dead trees. What's going on? And then they will realise, if you look at the climate data, it's just nudging them across the edge. So that's also a really important potential research project to have some longitudinal, you know, those longitudinal plots, thinking about it, maybe setting up some more. And I think their analysis was excluded fire as a factor. So it's something which again argues for these unburnt areas. So maybe rush out to some unburnt islands or something.
Well, I might have to cut everyone. I'm sorry. We're running out of time. We've gone over. But I invite everyone to come up to Yellow 2 to the morning tea room to chat further, David. It sounds like there's lots of questions. Thank you again for attending, everyone. Thank you, David, for speaking.
Yeah, pleasure.
But yeah, please come down.